Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Happy Saturday. It is a Saturday indeed. Today we're going to be talking about the language of personality. What does that mean exactly? Well, we're going to figure this out shortly. I want to specify that this video, an early version of this video was shared with my Patreon supporters as a little perk of supporting me. So don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. The link is down below in the description box. It's only €3 a month. If you want to donate more, you can, but it's not particularly demanding. And I aim to produce more of this exclusive content from now on. Usually content that I will maybe at a later stage kind of articulate on the main channel. But if you want to have the early stuff, you know what to do. Don't forget that you can also support me by getting either my book on the INFJ, The Ecstatic Soul, available below on Amazon, and The Infinite Castle, my new novel. Okay, both really nice products, really nice reviews. Check them out. Okay, so the language of MBTI. So what had I been sharing with my patrons, and what was the discussion that revolved around it? The intuition is a rather straightforward one to explain. The idea is that, if you like, there are two main strands that stimulate interest in personality types, I think, and these strands have objectives that are not necessarily easy to reconcile, and that in some ways they also have traits in common that, if pushed to their limit, could constitute a risk for the future of the discipline, of the area of interest, in terms of attracting new, newcomers, but also in terms of keeping itself inventive, keeping itself relevant to our society and to our own making sense of ourselves in society and the world. So the two strands are the first person, this is what I've been calling the first person interest, the first person interest and approach to personality type, and then the third person interest. The first person is the subjective. I prefer calling it first person because subjective sometimes has a connotation of being, invalid or less valid than the objective. So I prefer calling it a first person approach. That's more or less using the personality type as you've identified it as a tool, as a vector of self-exploration, self-description, understanding yourself better, making sense of yourself. Something that slightly more begins from the private, might go into the public domain, but starts from a private kind of perspective. Whereas the third person approach is the approach where one, as it were, has the objective of really just nailing down their type. It matters to them that exploration be anchored in something that is third person, objective, whatever you want to call it. Something that has a sort of independent validation, independent justification. So the third person approach that is echoed in, at least in name, by objective personality, and more so in reality as a serious undertaking by cognitive type. That third person approach, which often presents itself as having this scientific, goal behind it, scientific method at the core of it, is answering something that's very real in people. It's not that people are simply interested in subjective first-person exploration. A lot of people will say that their interest is predominantly first-person, but the very fact that sometimes when they communicate, all the time, really, like, they'll say to other people, as an INFJ this and other INFJs that, speaking as a community of INFJs, a through and through consistent first person approach would demand that every time someone says this, or a community constitutes itself around this idea, what we're really saying is we're a community of people who self-identify as INFJ. But I think a lot of the time people really mean we're a community of people who are INFJ. So in some sense, they are really straddling the world between, at the intersection of first person and third person. And they want to incorporate a bit of both. That explains also why there are people who just go to a lot of different typing services because they're hoping to nail out their type. So they ask Harry, they ask Michael Pierce, maybe, I don't know if he does typing services, they ask Cognitive Type, they ask Eric, they ask a lot of different typists, C.S. Joseph also, I guess, for some of them. This circle that doesn't seem to be able to close itself is obviously linked to the fact that the first person approach is not sufficient completely for some people. So there's a tension between the first person approach and this third person approach. And I guess what I want to offer is not necessarily a solution, but just maybe a slightly different way of looking at the situation. Maybe starting by looking at what this situation carries with it in terms of risk if we don't show ourselves to be capable of assessing it critically. Now, the critical approach, I would say, is that if you allow yourself in your first person approach to be too concerned with the third person approach, if you allow the third person approach in some sense to contaminate too much of your first person approach, the risk that you're taking, the risk that we're all taking, in fact, as YouTube content creators, like that's exactly the same, because it could turn out that our viewer base just stops increasing as much, or starts becoming stagnant, because we get to a stage where we no longer really have relevant things to say or new things to say. In other words, that everything has already been said, and people who continue watching are either just loyal people that maybe say watch my videos or Harry's videos because they really like Harry, or maybe they like me, they relate to me, so they like watching my new content more so for me than for what I actually talk about in the realm of personality. Because if we think of personality theory as something that ultimately must have a solution, must have a formula, and if we follow this formula, then we can nail down type. And once we've nailed down a type, whether it be INFJ or ISFJ, whatever it is, if we then move on to say, and then types also have their own formulas where we can know exactly what they are about. It's not about the lived experience of each and every INFJ. It's not the lived experience of each and every INTP and what they bring to the table from a first person viewpoint. If you say, well, there are all these characteristics, and if you fill these characteristics, if you match those characteristics, you fit them, you're that type, that's your life. Well, it's obvious that very quickly we're going to get to a stage where we've said everything, and then we're going to ossify. It's the term that I was using in the video to my patrons. The ossifying of a theory is also its death in some sense. It just becomes incorporated in people's sense-making of the world, and then they forget about the theory, and maybe eventually lose interest in what I have to say or what others have to say, because everything's been said. And that's the problem with a discourse that sees itself as potentially having a final solution, a solution that, once it's reached, then there's no going beyond it. And I think that's fine for a third person model that sees itself as through and through permeated by a scientific spirit, is not concerned with the first person. I think that's fine. Cognitive Type does that, it's fine. In fact, it turns out it's a very, very difficult process, and it's not like you suddenly become scientific. It's a journey, and it's going to take a long time, but at least it has that end goal in view. But I think that when it comes to most people, really, their fundamental interest is first person. They find it hard not to resist. They find it hard to resist the appeal of a certain kind of objectivity to get that reassurance that, ultimately, I must be that type. Again, the risk is that ossification of our theories, which ultimately means an ossification of our language, which is why I'm calling this video the language of personality, because the way in which we could look at this whole personality thing differently is by looking at it as a dynamic vocabulary, a dynamic language and a dynamic practice. In other words, the world is changing. I think we can all agree that the world in the 1920s was different from the world in the Renaissance, which was yet different from the world in the classical era of Greece, which was yet different from what it was like then in Africa, which is yet different from the world in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, 2020s, and it's going to continue changing. AI, technology, war, many other things, further globalization or further entrenching of certain nationalisms. What I mean is that the world is changing, which also means that if type is something that helps us to cope with the world, to make sense of ourselves and the world. But essentially, it's kind of a lens for coping, really. INFJs, perhaps even more so than SE leads in today's world, or T leads in today's world. Coping is important. But if the world changes, then our lens and our tool must also be able to change, must also be able to adapt. So maybe what it means to be an INFJ in classical Greece, or what it means to be an INFJ in the Middle Ages, is different from what it means to be an INFJ today, right? Or even what it meant to be an INFJ 40 years ago. So having this slightly more historicist lens is also kind of pressing forward the point that it's important that we don't let the language at the source of the MBTI theory or the personality theory to ossify itself into something unchanging, because then it's inevitable that at some stage it will lose its fit and become irrelevant. And if it becomes irrelevant, then no surprise that people would also lose interest. It becomes irrelevant because it's either becoming false or not true to the world, or just because it's not changing while the world is changing, and always presenting new sets of challenges and situations that demand resolving. And we need a language of personality to be able to constantly be in conversation with that evolving world. How to remain relevant by keeping our language dynamic is, I think, by conceiving of the various models and theories of personality, Jung, of MBTI, of cognitive type. Let's leave it aside because, again, it's predominantly the third person, but any model, Harry's model, things like that. It's providing, first and foremost, words, a vocabulary for self-description of ourselves and of our relationship to the world. It's providing us with words, concepts, so that we can continue coping, can make sense of things. But that vocabulary, like any vocabulary of a live language, not like Latin and Greek, is always evolving. It's always changing. It's always coming up with new terms. It's always coming up with new descriptions. An activity of constant redescription of ourselves as INFJs, as INFPs, as other types is fundamental to avoid an ossification of our theories. And that, I think, goes through an appreciation of the fact that ultimately the first person is what motivates us primarily, and that the third person is really attained through the lens of relating to people who happen to have a similar first person experience. But the first person is more fundamental than the third person. And this objectifying of the first person experience is legitimate so far as it's always appreciated as fundamentally a first person experience that needs new words, new tools to continue coping with the world as it evolves. It's a vocabulary that we ought to keep alive, somewhat like a language, providing new texts, new books. It doesn't have to be a scientific theory as such. That can exist as a side-by-side kind of project next to the first-person project, but the dynamism of the vocabulary is crucial. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts on this are and if you agree with me. So let me know in the comments, and I will see you tomorrow. Don't forget about my Patreon page. See you guys. Bye-bye.